Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. Welcome back to those of you who have been with us since noon for our conference on prosperity and human security, Japan and Asia's 21st century governance challenges. We had a really exciting discussion from noon for our first event, looking at global health and Asia's approach. And today we're going to continue now in the afternoon session from 3, looking at development, climate change, and climate migration. This is a really important set of topics, and the conference is being brought to you by the program, as well as the generous funding of the Japan Foundation, with co-sponsors the Harvard Asia Center, Takemi Program on Health, the University Center on the Environment, and the Harvard Undergraduate Policy Network. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a tremendous panel here to talk about climate change and climate migration as issues that are of really great importance to East Asia. And we have 3 leading experts to help us through this conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Yves Tiberghien, who is Professor of Political Science and Konwakai Chair in Japanese Research and Director of the Center for Japanese Research at the University of British Columbia. He has spent many years at Harvard, and we're really happy to have him come back to us. He has published extensively on corporate governance and finance, environment and public health, Japan and East Asia. His books include a wide range of topics from entrepreneurial states, reforming corporate governance in France, Japan, and Korea, to his work on East Asia, COVID-19 paradox, which I understand it came out in 2021 and they're already asking for another edition. He is the co-founder of the Vision 20 Initiative, a new coalition of global scholars and policymakers that are providing long-term perspectives on the challenges of global economic and environmental governance. Really one of those few scholars who could talk to the regional issues with a comprehensive perspective on issues and country approaches. He's going to talk to us today about making sense of climate green tech acceleration under Suga and Kishida. Our next speaker is Nicholas Fraser, who is the Japan Foundation Policy Innovations Fellow at the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. He has received his PhD in political science from the University of Toronto, and he is doing incredible research on a range of issues that are so important today, thinking about the politics of identity. How do we grapple with ethnicity, immigration, and how are these policies being debated through the bureaucratic and judicial processes of government in Japan and other countries. His work has already been published, looking at Japanese attitudes towards immigration. He's published an article in the Journal of Refugee Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and another article in Political Psychology. Building on this recent work, his research project for the year here at Harvard has been looking at public opinion impact on Japan's approach to refugee protection. And he will be talking today deservingness criteria and public support for refugee admission. Our final speaker joining us online is Joanna Lewis. Thank you so much for coming, even when we can't offer you food and in-person entertainment, but we're delighted to have you join us online. Joanna Lewis is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment. She serves as the Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. She has 2 decades of experience working on international climate change and clean energy policy with a focus on China. At Georgetown, she's running a very important group, the Clean Energy Climate Research Group, which has many dialogues that facilitate US-China climate change engagement. She's the author of several important books, including Green Innovation in China from Columbia Press in 2013, which won the International Studies Association 2014 Harold and Margaret Strout Award. She was also the lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th assessment report, showing the promise for scholars engaging directly in the policymaking process. Today, we're going to hear her talk about the global geopolitics of China's low-carbon transition. Great, well, we have 3 experts and limited time. I've asked each to speak 15 to 20 minutes so that we will have a little time for question and answer at the end of our session. We'll start off with Yves.
Thank you very much, Christina and Kishida for the maestros of this beautiful symposium. It's a great pleasure and honor. Thank you, Jennifer, as well, for all the work. Great pleasure being back here. Always a fountain of knowledge and a place of great stimulation, Harvard. Wonderful to see many former friends, colleagues, and former student Nick, who is doing great. So I'm trying to look here at the Japan angle of a big story. And the big story is what's happening with climate and green tech. So there is a combination of bad news and good news. The bad news, as we have seen in 2022, is the acceleration of climate catastrophes and weather events. This is a picture I took from my home in BC in a place that's supposed to not look like this. And now we have 2 weeks a year that look like this. But on the other hand, we see an explosion of EVs, solar panels. And so we are finally living through the exponential growth of green tech. So both things are happening at the same time. At the broad level, well, the good news is we are finally seeing extremely serious action toward climate globally, and green tech is indeed catching up. We now have in electricity generation between 2020 and 2022, the share of renewable energies went from 20% to 29%. That's a pretty significant jump, and the jump is going to keep accelerating in this decade. However, at the same time, we see that we are living through a race, essentially, to invent, produce, and deploy green technologies on a massive scale. And that comes with a corollary. Because the market cannot move fast enough, because we have too many subsidies for carbon that are embedded in the structure, we now see all states, more and more states, seeing this through the angle of national economic security and the understanding that this is not just about climate anymore. This is about an industrial revolution that will change the pecking order of nations and the competitiveness of nations. In the 2030s, those who are not active or leading in green tech will fall behind. Green tech, along with digital technology, is one of the two twin engines of the future industrial revolution. So it's a battle for the dominance of the future economy. And so we are living through the shift in the paradigm. We're living through a change from the Washington consensus market paradigm to a return of industrial policy. And one of the leaders now of this return to industrial policy is none other than the US. The IRA, which is wrongly named by this giant climate bill, has almost $400 billion of subsidies. That is having a huge sucking sound in moving out, European industries, for example, toward the US. And the EU is left as one of the holdovers, the Washington consensus, while the US has already deserted. So we're living through really a big shift in global political economy. And those twin industrial revolutions are going to reshape the whole political economy. So just an indicator, we now have, for example, a battle around minerals. And China was ahead of everybody else in understanding that this was not just about climate, but it was about the future economy of the 2030s. I had the luck of interviewing Xie Zhenhua, the chief Chinese negotiator, for a couple hours, 2017. And he told me already that we decided back in 2012 that this was a strategic choice for the industrial transformation of China. This was not about climate. This is about strategic industrial transformation. And so, although China doesn't control the production of lithium or cobalt or nickel, it became the leader in processing those minerals, while other people were not very active. And so we have, 60 to 75% of the processing of all those happening in China, and everyone is catching up with it now, including Japan. So the questions here for my presentation on Japan is, to what extent is Japan pushing the frontier in climate policy under its green transformation strategy, GX? What are the key features? And what are the drivers behind the choices made by Japan under Suga and Kishida with respect to nuclear policy, renewables, and the continuation of coal? What has shaped the new vision that Japan is taking? And I have a set of observations and a couple arguments. The observations are as follows. Number one, the 3/11 shock was a massive disruption to Japan's climate policies and set Japan back for years. However, thanks to some gains in energy efficiency and renewable increases, Japan's emission peaked in 2013 and gradually fell from 2013 to 2020 by 18%. So there is a good news here, even though it's not fast enough. Under Shinzo Abe, there was gradualism in this approach. However, Prime Minister Suga made climate change a major priority for his cabinet. And in the fall of 2020, he's the one who announced Japan's pledge to reach net zero emissions by 2030. In April 2021, he added to this by committing Japan to a 46% decrease of emissions by 2030 from the 2013 peak, which was a jump from the 25% reduction commitment made by Abe at the Paris Agreement. Prime Minister Kishida has followed exactly on the same targets, has not changed them, and has emphasized and enhanced the GX strategic vision with an added emphasis on nuclear energy, as well as ammonia and hydrogen processes for coal, in addition to the acceleration of solar and EVs and wind. Now, for the causal argument, is that I would like to argue here that Japan's climate policy development was traditionally dominated by a technocratic decision-making in an iron triangle. That's very classic, and I've worked on in several pieces and articles with Miranda Schurz on explaining that. That generated cautious policymaking, gradualism, and usually a focus on the long-term viability of existing assets. They're very worried about that. However, under Suga and Kishida, the acceleration of climate policy is a response not of the iron triangle gradualism, but of political leadership in response to two forces. One is competition in East Asia, including China, but also Korea. And second, overtures from the Biden administration and an acceleration and strong incentives and push. More importantly, the stepped up commitments by Japan are embedded in a new comprehensive vision of economic and energy security that views now the current competition over green technology in the Indo-Pacific as critical for future economic competitiveness. And this is what falls under GX. And under GX, climate policy is turning into industrial policy. And so it's a bigger story than just climate. I acknowledge here two great RAs, Uno Kakegawa and Mo Gasmi, as well as support from Japan Foundation here too, to the NBR for this little piece. So I'll just show a bit of data. First, the trend line, where was Japan going? There was, after the Kyoto Agreement, a sort of peaking. So we had a plateau, and then the peak was reached in 2007, initially. With the 2008-2009 financial crisis, there was a drop by 10%, and then there was a bounce back, especially after the 3/11, because part of the Kyoto implementation plan was reliant on nuclear. Nuclear traditionally at 30% of electricity generation, which means 16% of total energy consumption. Then the Fukushima shock was pretty massive because it took out the 30% of electrical generation, which was replaced, one, by efficiency, so cut, maybe almost 10% of electricity was cut. And meanwhile, natural gas and coal in particular increased to replace the loss. So it's a pretty massive shock on any system. And we see it, whichever way we look at it, there's this big jump initially that really put Japan off course. One consequence of this, by the way, was to make Japan very quiet in global negotiations. So in global climate negotiations, I interviewed, for example, Laurent Fabius, the chair of the COP21 in Paris, and he said, Japan didn't want to stick its neck out, so we had to drag them in, but eventually they supported it. So it's very different from the Japan we saw in Copenhagen with Hatoyama. Hatoyama is coming out with flamboyant targets for a while. So that was the reality. So post 3/11, we had a new peak in 2013, which was an increase of 8% from 2010. And then we have the 18% down slide from 2013 to 2020, which puts Japan just 10% below 1990 level, which is just a little better than the Kyoto target it had for initially for 2010. So part of that decrease includes the return of a few nuclear reactors, and we get by 2021 to almost 6% of electricity that's nuclear. And now we have a few more reactors. We have 9 now. But there's also a significant increase in renewables from 12 to 22% of electricity generation between 2014 and 2020. At the global level, Japan shrunk from 5% to 3% of global emissions. But in terms of historic responsibility, we're still at 5%. And per capita, we went from 11 tons of CO2 to 9 tons of CO2. It's, however, deemed inefficient by usual trackers of climate action. Then we have the Suga period, and we got a couple big steps. The first big step is the Diet speech just a month after he took office, in which he committed to the net zero pledge by 2050. Now, note that this followed net zero pledges by China and Korea. So Japan followed, but it was happening at the same time, pretty much. So we can observe from that speech, it's a major shift in Japan's gradual approach. And it indicated already that Suga saw this fight not just as climate policy, but also as being linked to the project of industrial transformation and to future growth. There was no implementation plan at that point. And Suga followed the speech with the creation of an expert panel, however. The second major step took place in Washington at the Biden climate summit, and Suga at that point increased the commitment of emission cut by 2030, which was a more practical target, is very short term, as well as the increase with renewables. And those pledges were previewed the day before at the Global Warming Prevention Headquarters at the Kante. And this time there's a full action plan. So a lot happened between October and that April-May moment. And then Kishida followed up on this at the COP26 in Glasgow. He just followed on Suga's plans and he announced them. However, Japan still got the fossil award because Japan was still committed to have 20% of coal in its energy mix by 2030. And also, general, the NGO community doesn't believe in this idea of clean coal through ammonia and hydrogen. Then there is the new Kishida commitment that happened in this fall in the policy speech. And now it's talking of a fundamental reform of economy, society, and industry, a green transformation that's very holistic. But at the same time, so it's balancing that pledge with the concern on stable supply of energy, which is a longstanding Japanese concern since Meiji period. It goes back very, very traditional in Japanese industrial policy. And that goal is more salient in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the big energy shock at the global level. The blueprint that came out from METI is around the S+3E strategy. So S means safety is the core premise, and then the 3 is stable and resilient energy supply, and that's number 1. So there's still a caveat here. Second, environmental suitability, and third, economic efficiency of energy. And METI is still the architect here. So what are the drivers? We could see that there is a break here from the stable pattern of climate policy. And clearly we had an influx of political leadership that we hadn't seen under Abe, for example. So traditionally in Japan for 30 years, climate policy has been shaped by 2 major realities. One is the entrenched policy networks, the Iron Triangle. On the other hand, the Westminster parliamentary system, which occasionally generates incentives for leaders to get involved. So that happened on the Koizumi, actually, for the ratification battle of Kyoto. So during Kyoto, those are the arguments I made with Miranda first. We saw the coalition, the Iron Triangle, the normal coalition being pushed by NGO pressures and political leadership at the time of high saliency in public opinion. So it's a case of symbolic politics, of ideas being pushed by public opinion and letting political leadership to get involved. However, after that phase, during the implementation, we returned to the weight of inertia. And METI was winning most of the battles along with K-9, and there was a lack of political leadership. So this is the main story. And even today, by the way, there is a weak public opinion incentive for leaders to act on climate. While people are aware of it, there is an understanding that actions are inefficient. This is the BBC GlobeScan opinion poll that was just before the COP26, and it shows Japan way down there. Only 39% of Japanese think that Japan should play a leadership role in climate change policy, unlike many countries in the global south or Europe that are in the 60–70% range. Even India is at 56%. The US at 56%. So we are a lot lower here. So in terms of salience or the reality of the public opinion push. However, two major arguments took place, two major forces. One was peer pressure within East Asia and a competitive dynamic. The second was the Biden administration coaxing and gaiatsu, the good old gaiatsu. And so that led to all those commitments. And two of the commitments were made either in the US or at the G7 meeting. And by the way, Korea was also coaxed and incentivized to do the same thing at the same time. The second argument is there was political leadership. On the Suga, we rely on two primary ministers, Taro Kono and Koizumi Shinjiro, who were well known in this community at Harvard. We had a hand. Also Hiromichi Mizuno, special advisor at METI. But it was part of a paradigm shift, a fundamental shift in the understanding of climate as a story of competition and industrial policy. That would have a critical role in the future of Japan's role in the global economy. Suga, in his policy speech in January 2021, says Japan will realize a decarbonized society ahead of the rest of the world. So that's new, right? It's not just about beating climate, it's about beating each other, beating others. And then the application cases, the empirical focus right now, but I won't have time now, are renewable energy, nuclear energy, ammonia and hydrogen, and electric vehicles. And there's a lot to say on each one, but I'll conclude now. So under Suga and Kishida, Japan has stepped up its climate commitments, including a net zero pledge and a big emission cut by 2030. These pledges will not occur through a pure renewable future. However, they include nuclear energy and coal. But the key point here is Japan's new approach is part of an integrated vision of green technology as a major arena of economic security and competition among nations. Thank you. There will be a symposium at UBC, and several of you are target invitees, including Joanna, either in June or September, on the political economy of the twin industrial revolutions. So welcome, and those are the questions and the rationale.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank everyone for attending, but especially Shin and Christina for organizing this, Jennifer for doing all of the logistical hard work. It's an honor to be here with mentors such as Yves and Joe, who've been with me throughout my intellectual developments. I want to talk to you about one aspect of what will become a major issue, that is climate migration. So before I get into the nitty-gritty, imagine that you are a political leader in the near future, and the polar ice caps melt. And suddenly millions of people have to leave their homes and go somewhere else. A lot of the world is low-lying area where people are going to be susceptible to rising water levels. But what we see in recent years also, not just in the developing world, but California, British Columbia, my home province in Canada of Alberta, is wildfires. have become a significant issue. And these issues aren't going away. In fact, they're probably going to increase exponentially in the coming decades. And one aspect of this, again, is migration. Now, we tend to think about refugees as people fleeing political circumstances. In fact, the Refugee Convention, which was created in the aftermath of World War II, thought about refugees in these terms: people fleeing states, totalitarian states, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. And in this case, refugee was defined at the time as a person fleeing what's referred to as a state agent of persecution. So these were political refugees. But climate change forces us to think about how we might think about the term refugee generally. We're probably going to have to update what we mean by that. And if we look at a country like Japan, only 10 years ago, the 3/11 disaster created internally displaced people. People in Japan were forced to leave their homes, and most of them were not able to return. And this had nothing to do with state persecution or political dynamics, but it was a natural disaster. So if we think about this large public policy issue, the question is, especially in democracies such as Canada, the US, Japan, how do you convince a public that is skeptical that we should admit refugees in the first place? What I'm going to do is talk to you about one way that we might approach this issue. And that is convincing people to host refugees, not because they not for political reasons, but because they need help. So that's some of my research here. Previous studies have focused on why people oppose hosting refugees. There are a range of issues here. I mean, first, you can't control where refugees go. Things happen sporadically, and suddenly people show up without warning. And you have to grapple with sudden arrivals. And voters in the host country tend not to like that. Secondly, there are real questions about plausible security risks, even if we're only talking about a handful of people who might actually pose real security risks. We saw this with the Syrian refugee crisis, concerns that ISIS would send people with refugees, even though that was largely speculation. There's also a question about how you integrate people into the socioeconomic dynamics long term. If you're bringing refugees, you can't necessarily afford to be picky about what their skills are, right? So these are legitimate concerns. But a question that has been asked less often within social science, but especially within political science, is why do people support hosting refugees? In my own home country of Canada, in 2015, the Syrian refugee crisis was a major election issue. It's also been election issues in other countries as well. So people definitely support hosting refugees, but the question is why? We know less about this. So refugee protection is an international norm, right? We're committed to human rights, and refugee protection is an outgrowth of that. Some literature has looked at broadly the connection between natives' humanitarian values and their support for admitting immigrants. But what is humanitarianism? And why does it lead people to host refugees, support hosting refugees? These theoretical conceptual issues haven't really been addressed with much depth. So I argue in a study published with Go Murakami that humanitarianism is a psychological impulse. It's universal. It doesn't depend on national culture. And humanitarians are people who are inclined to help those in need, simply put. A wealth of psychological literature has explored this and proven this in multiple settings, including in the Japanese setting. So this is psychological. And humanitarians are careful about who they want to give help to. They don't want to help people who might be deceiving them or people who might not need help. They want to target their help so that the most needy are the ones that they spend their time on. So in other words, they apply what's called a deservingness heuristic. They believe that some people are more deserving of help than others. And they use information shortcuts, to decide who those people are. So why would they want to support hosting refugees? Well, refugees flee dangerous circumstances, right? So unlike economic migrants, people are often compelled to flee. They don't necessarily get to choose when and where they go. They have to leave to save their lives. Refugee protection is also most likely to resonate with humanitarians because it's about helping other people. And humanitarians probably care most about why refugees are fleeing so that they can target their help, directing it towards those who are fleeing circumstances beyond their control, as opposed to people who flee circumstances that they might have had some role in creating. So the logical implication here is that people who flee natural disasters are the best candidate for convincing humanitarians to support hosting refugees, excuse me. This also implies that humanitarians are most likely to support hosting people who flee the adverse effects of climate change, because climate change will be defined by natural disasters. So why Japan? Japan is a developed democracy. It's a historically ethnic nation. It has a strict policy legacy when it comes to refugee policy that I'll talk about in a minute. But despite that, the number of asylum claims Japan receives has grown significantly. And about 5 years ago, they received about the same number of asylum applications as Canada. So this problem isn't going away. More and more people are filing asylum claims in Japan. Now, since 2017, the application number has dropped to about around 10,000 a year, but that is still significant compared to what it was about 20 years ago, which was a few hundred people. And we would expect that, because of its strict policy legacy, because it's not historically an immigrant society, that Japan is a hard case for this theory that humanitarians support hosting refugees, especially since humanitarianism is universal. It's a personality trait. So if it should work anywhere, it should work in Japan. Otherwise, this humanitarian deservingness theory might have some major flaws. So this is why Go and I decided to test our theory there. So just briefly, Japan does receive resettlement refugees, people who are vetted over there in the place that they come from, usually refugee camps before they come to Japan. Japan has admitted about 30 people a year since around 2010. It was the first East Asian country to launch a government sponsorship of refugees program or a resettlement program. And it also has a very strict asylum policy. So asylum is when people spontaneously arrive and they're vetted in the host country and they file a refugee claim. So we can see Japan in the middle there between Italy and Luxembourg. It has among the lowest asylum recognition rates in the developed world, and it's had these low recognition rates for decades. And the bars, that's the average recognition rates for all of these countries for this period. So this is just a blown up version of that. So very low recognition rates. And in the bottom left panel there, you see Japan at the very small corner here. It receives very few asylum claims, or has, compared to most countries, vis-a-vis its per capita population, and it grants protection to very few people. Source country doesn't matter either, right? So irrespective of where these refugees come, the recognition rates are very low. The numbers there are just percentage of applications accepted. So in terms of policies, institutions, refugee flows, and party politics matter. And previous studies of Japan have argued that Japan is ruled by a conservative party, the LDP, and also that Japanese tend to have this ethno-nationalist view of Japanese society, and so that neither political elites nor the public wants refugees. Elite and public support for this strict policy legacy, in other words. That's what previous studies have argued. But politicians have been under pressure to try to change the system in the mid-2000s. I won't talk about that today. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So they have grappled with reforms that previous studies don't explain. And also, many of these studies don't really look at public opinion today. They tend to look at public opinion during the 1980s, when Japan had received several thousand refugees from Southeast Asia, fleeing the collapse of South Vietnam. So there hasn't really been a lot of attention on this issue recently, particularly when there's more pressure for Japan to accept refugees. Lastly, the public might have different views on this vis-a-vis LDP politicians, right? So a lot of studies haven't considered that. I'm not going to talk about the institutional politics, but rather public opinion. But that is to say, I'm happy to talk about the bureaucratic politics of Japan's refugee policy in the Q&A. So we ran a survey 3 years ago, and we wanted to see how voters would respond to a hypothetical refugee crisis. And could you convince them that certain criteria or certain aspects of why people flee might be more persuasive than others? So this was a survey experiment. In the descriptive part of the survey, interestingly enough, we found that a majority of respondents said, yes, Japan should accept refugees. And we did a vignette experiment here. The key attribute I'm going to focus on is event, number one. But we looked at the source country, whether or not they got public housing, which is a proxy for social welfare redistribution, and political support. And we asked how many refugees should be admitted if this crisis were to take place, and to what degree would you agree with a government policy to accept these people? So again, I'm just going to focus on events. In terms of a natural disaster, we looked at people fleeing earthquakes, vis-a-vis people fleeing protests that were put down by the local government, or a civil war. And then as a baseline category or the control, we used domestic labor shortages to compare as a baseline for comparison. So this is the result. The MMs is the descriptive results. The AMCEs, that's the regression results. What we find in the top two panels there is that people were significantly more likely to support hosting refugees when they were fleeing a natural disaster. In this case, an earthquake. The other thing that's not on the slide is that we have measures of people's propensity to identify as humanitarians. And we found that humanitarians were the most likely to say, I want to help the people fleeing an earthquake. They cared most about why refugees were fleeing. So we see this as evidence for our theory that humanitarianism predicts support for hosting refugees. Interestingly enough, LDP support didn't really matter, and neither did public housing. We found that really interesting because this contradicts previous studies in political science. We also found that the humanitarians cared less about where the refugees came from, right? So if you had lower humanitarian sentiment, you cared more if they came from China or Hong Kong. But if you were higher in humanitarianism, you cared more about why they fled. So in summary, Japanese with higher levels of humanitarian sentiment most strongly support hosting refugees. And humanitarians cared most about why the refugees fled. We did a follow-up study recently that I'll show you the results of, preliminary results of now. We wanted to see if other types of natural disasters would change how people felt, because Japan has a history of large earthquakes. So there might be some bias there. So again, we've had a vignette, and I'm just going to focus on disaster. So we had a hypothetical scenario of a refugee crisis where multiple things are going wrong and people have to flee. And we manipulated whether or not a natural disaster occurred and the type of disaster. Again, we used a survey experiment. So the disasters that we manipulated this time was earthquake, but also wildfire and flood, because wildfires and floods are most likely to occur due to climate change. So these are the results, preliminary. We also manipulated how many people died in this hypothetical scenario. Interestingly enough, it seems that people don't really care what type of disaster it is, but they do care about the severity. So that is consistent with our theory that humanitarians want to help people who are fleeing dangerous circumstances. Again, this is just preliminary results, but I'm out of time. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to this conference today. I apologize that I'm not able to be there in person and appreciate the opportunity to participate virtually this afternoon. So my presentation today is going to pick up on some of the themes that Yves raised regarding green industrial policy and the broader global geopolitics of the clean energy transition. And I'm going to focus specifically on China, which is where most of my work is based. So of course, we are in what scientists refer to as the pivotal decade for addressing climate change. Essentially, if we do not make some pretty significant changes globally to reduce our emissions this decade, and specifically, we need to reduce global emissions by almost half this decade to not rule out limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the level at which we would want to be at globally to avoid some of the most dangerous impacts of climate change that's above pre-industrial. And the other thing to keep in mind is that countries are not on track to meet this goal in terms of the policies that have been pledged to date. So this is a useful diagram put together by the Climate Action Tracker, which shows essentially, this black line is historical emissions. The green is where we need to get to if we're going to be on a 1.5 degrees Celsius compatible global pathway. And then these blue wedges are essentially where we would be with current climate pledges that were made both under the Paris Agreement and then through subsequent pledges that countries made in the lead up to Glasgow and since then. So you can see we still have quite a ways to go globally. And we are also not on track for what's referred to as essentially secure, resilient, and sustainable supply chains to manufacture the clean energy technologies that we will need to achieve that transition. So, of course, getting onto this lower emissions pathway requires the rollout of substantial amounts of low carbon technologies, renewables, et cetera. And we have a gap in terms of production capacity. Now, of course, companies are scaling up with projected global demand for low carbon technologies, but Of course, right now we're in a situation where there's geographic concentration in a handful of countries, China included, that leads to a greater risk of supply chain disruptions. And of course, there's just increasingly more and more concerns about this in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as concerns about over-reliance on China. And then, of course, from an environmental perspective, expanding clean energy supply chains leads to unsustainable expansion of mining critical materials, and I'll talk more about that. So this is just a chart from a very recent IEA study, which demonstrates the scale in terms of total investment needed to move into some of these new supply chain areas. So, of course, China plays a very important role in the global low carbon transition for a variety of reasons. Of course, it's the largest emitter on an annual basis, the largest manufacturer of pretty much every clean energy technology that countries will need to achieve this transition: wind, solar, increasingly batteries and EVs, even hydropower, and then so many sort of advanced fossil fuel technologies as well. And then China has, of course, also, as was mentioned earlier, been experimenting over the last several decades with the large-scale implementation of industrial policy to promote these clean energy industries in a way that restricts market entry and international trade. This works to their advantage to some respects and can be detrimental in others. But as a result of this rise in these industries, as well as the use of these sorts of policies targeting trading partners, it is therefore, been subject to broader political, economic, and security and economic concerns, particularly from the US and the EU, with broad calls being made in recent months for decoupling clean energy supply chains in particular from the Chinese market. And this really this broader situation creates additional geopolitical barriers to the low carbon transition, which are less often examined, in the sort of climate policy, climate technology world. There's just a lot of focus on, okay, how much technology do we need to deploy? At what cost? Where does it go? Which technologies make the most sense? But if we sort of ignore these broader geopolitics, I argue in a lot of my work recently that there's just going to be major implications for our ability to actually achieve a low carbon transition, because we're going to see much higher costs than predicted due to these sort of supply chain inefficiencies and due to these political tensions. And I'll come back to that. So in terms of just spending a few minutes on China's domestic climate and energy emissions situation, we saw actually China's greenhouse gas emissions surge during the pandemic, while many other countries saw emissions fall. This was, of course, because China sort of was open longer at the early stages of the pandemic and saw some of the worst impacts much later than other countries. China, of course, still gets the vast majority of its energy from coal, and coal is responsible for the largest share of emissions in China. And that is despite the fact that China has a lot of policies in place to try to accelerate a transition away from coal. Many energy experts said that they expected China had actually peaked its coal use about a decade ago, but we now know that's not the case, and coal consumption is continuing to increase. But at the same time, we see very rapid growth in new renewable energy technologies. So record growth rates still, even again with the continued increases in coal. You see higher capacity increases going in over the last few years in technologies like wind power and solar. So China has, of course, relatively ambitious climate targets and goals on the books. There are several embedded within the 14th Five-Year Plan in terms of energy intensity and carbon intensity targets, as well as a non-fossil energy goal, which includes both renewables and nuclear. And these are all, sort of more stringent than business as usual. And I can talk more about that if you're interested. But and then we have the NDC that China pledged in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, and then revised slightly to make it somewhat more ambitious in the last year, and then the carbon neutrality goal, which is this longer term 2060 goal to achieve full carbon neutrality of China's energy system. The challenge of this, though, in the Chinese context is that in order for, considering that China's emissions are still increasing and at a very rapid rate, you actually see, in order to go essentially from peaking in 2030 to a full 2060 goal of carbon neutrality, China would essentially have to do this really rapid, turning the ship around and reverse course in a way that we've just never seen before. Emissions would have to start declining after this 2030 peak at least 8 to 10% per year, and then drop by 90% over 2 decades. And we've just never seen any country achieve this in that time frame. China does a lot of things other countries haven't been able to achieve, but this is really seems mathematically challenging. Of course, there's been a lot of focus in the last few years on the Belt and Road Initiative, and particularly the impact on climate of the large-scale energy investments that China was leading the world in overseas, particularly Southeast Asia. But we've seen a real shift actually just in the last couple of years, where we've seen no coal investments from China in 2021 and from where we have data for 2022 so far. But we're not really seeing the kind of full-fledged replacement of this financing going towards clean energy. So that's, I think a real opportunity for China to increase the way that it's supporting clean energy, not just within China, but outside of China, particularly as one of the major manufacturers of these technologies. So I want to talk briefly about this topic of supply chains. And if you're not familiar, this is a nice diagram that lays out, if you kind of go from right to left, some of the key technologies, for example, solar and wind, and then the specific supply chain elements where there are particular issues. For example, within wind turbines, we look a lot at nacelle manufacturing, permanent magnets, as well as the towers and the blades. And really where we see in this technology, for example, where the bottlenecks are, it's not so much the tower and the blades. These are heavy things that are more challenging to trade, but in the permanent magnets and then the nacelles themselves, the covering in the center of the turbine. And as Yves mentioned earlier, China is a leading producer in many key clean energy technology supply chain segments. This is the red you see here, and this is across PV, wind, both onshore and offshore, batteries for electric vehicles, as well as fuel cell trucks, heat pumps, electrolyzers, et cetera. So this creates a situation, and again, China got here, through very strategic deployment of industrial policy over a couple decades, really first for wind, then for solar, then for batteries. And this is really creating these rising geopolitical tensions as the US and others are trying to also now capture local manufacturing of these technologies through their own industrial policy strategies like the IRA. And when you look not just at the technologies themselves, but the materials that go into them, including both critical materials and others, you see again, China dominating in the processing of many of these things. And it's not so much that China, again, has most of these materials globally. They've just, again, are sort of ahead of the curve in getting these things processed. And it takes a while to really ramp this up in other markets. I did a recent study that looked at specifically the US-China integration issue and how we should think about, what are the real political risks, economic risks, security risks to the United States of integration with China across. We looked at 5 key sort of clean energy or low carbon technologies, and looked at each element of the supply chain and came up with a typology to talk about sort of where we should really think about. Again, this is from a US perspective, where the government should actually, be careful and sort of think about decoupling where there'd be actual benefit to China to not being integrated, versus many other areas where there's sort of less concern. And this is really just about trying to promote a more less of a one size fits all and a much more nuanced approach to how we think about these things. Right now, here in Washington, there's just real feeling that, we shouldn't do any science and technology cooperation with China. There's just a lot of risk to doing anything that could result in harm to the United States in terms of IP theft and other issues that have been discussed today. But this is just not, a blanket risk across all technologies and across all supply chains due to their unique characteristics. And the fact that we see these increasing geopolitical tensions in the clean energy sector is leading to, in response to protectionism, is leading to more and more trade disputes. Some of the comparative work I've done on East Asia, you can see that it's not just China that is, of course, been doing green industrial policy in the clean energy space, Japan as well, South Korea as well. And then you see several countries throughout the region that have also been targeted by green industrial policy, so targeted through trade sanctions or other measures. So this is certainly an issue within the broader region in East Asia as well as around the world. So to end, I think I think we are making progress internationally, in terms of climate action, but especially in the last couple of years, with the global pandemic, with the war in Europe, climate action is being sidelined as many other geopolitical crises have been looming large. And China, as the largest emitter, is sort of in this situation where they have pledged ambitious goals on the books, but are not making sufficient action this decade or sufficient progress this decade to enable the transition that would be needed to get to these mid-century goals. And so I think this is a concern when we look at, the trends there again, and this is even with record-breaking clean energy deployment there. And then these broader tensions over supply chain integration, I think, are only going to increase, if not, in the coming months and years, as more and more countries, states, and companies are really looking to do local sourcing of these materials, and you're going to see increasing tensions with this protectionism. And again, this is now in many ways sort of the US and Europe and others sort of looking to compete directly with China by using some of the policies that were actually so successful for China, even if you're looking at potentially violating WTO and other trade laws. And then lastly, I think it's unfortunate diplomatic engagement on this topic is relatively non-existent. We do, for example, in the United States, have a US-China climate working group, which has been reinstated since November. And, there are many discussions happening there, but not really in this area. So I do think it's unfortunate that Blinken's visit was postponed. These are important conversations that need to happen so that we don't see tensions escalate even further. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanna. That was a fantastic panel and raises a whole set of issues, everything from green industrial policy to responding to climate refugees and how to adjust our policies and attitudes. I want to open up to conversation with everyone here or anyone joining online. We're going to start off with our associate Ichiro Matsuo, who's an associate writer for the Asahi Shimbun, a Fulbright scholar, and has been spending the year here at Harvard researching megatons to megawatts program.
Hi, thank you very much, doctors. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. I am former Ministry of Environment correspondent, and I traveled a lot with the then Minister Shinjiro Koizumi. So I joined in as a press. I joined in the COP25 in Madrid, 2019. So I know very well how much Ministry of Environment was fighting with the METI. So I was really interested in the presentation by the Dr. Professor Tiberghien. Yeah, frankly speaking, I totally agree with you. But So this is not really a question, but rather I have a comment about your presentation. Yeah, I know what happened, especially after the Abe's departure, and the Suga came to the power, and then move on to the Kishida. So Suga's environmental policy, as far as I know, and I watched, it was a kind of also it was the political power shift within the LDP. So for me, it is not so simple policy change in the field of whatever greenhouse gas reduction. And I was more interested in the Professor, how do you regard about the policy itself? In my opinion, it's like the either METI or Ministry of Environment or even the Cabinet Minister's Office. They are tended to more focusing on the policy of the adaptation. And frankly speaking, most of the ministries do not so much care about the mitigation. So mitigation means the reduction of the greenhouse gas itself. Rather, policymakers want to have the adaptation because the adaptation requires investment. So maybe you can make a huge tall walls alongside of river or whatever. It will be always a huge investment. So it's very, very happy for the LDP politicians, especially. So anyway, from such a viewpoint, Suga's policy is not, in my opinion, 100% environmental friendly or something. So I'd like to listen to your opinion and your experience.
Fascinating comment. So it's Hideshi Matsuo, right? Matsuo-san.
Yes.
So thank you so much. I would love to talk a lot more with you because you know many things I don't know. So I do agree that this is not, in a sense, a climate policy designed for climate purposes, with NGOs and public and MOE at the heart, right? It's still politician and METI driven. It's more, in that sense, strategic. I have yet to do some interviews, but I did some a year ago. It was just around Madrid or no, before Glasgow. And I remember over ocean plastic, there was, I remember many people were still laughing at because they always arrive too late in the Kante because the Kante is controlled by many people. And so everything was drafted before the MOE ever had a chance to say anything. So this is still the political reality, right? But however, it could still have a big change on the mitigation in the sense that if there's also a strategic vision that's growing within METI, that there is an industrial revolution going on, and that the economy of the 2030s will be green and digital globally, then that does change something. Even from a METI perspective, even if they don't listen to Konwakai show, they still have to worry about, the fact that Toyota has to shift very quickly now, and they worry about battery and they worry about lithium because they don't want China to lead everything. And so that will have effects, if they do accelerate solar and all this, it will have a positive effect on mitigation. But we see also the footprint of METI. They do that, okay, but they also want the pet project in hydrogen and ammonia, and we don't know if it's going to work or if it's a delusion, as a climate tracker says. And also they want nuclear, and unfortunately, nuclear is a bit of a dream. It's unlikely to get enough public support to go to the level they want. So in that sense, yeah, the facts on the ground are not lined up yet was what they're promising. So I would be in between, but so there's a lot of things missing, and there's still some delusion that are METI-driven maybe, but on the other hand, there is a reality of change because of the strategic competition going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
But I'd love to talk a lot more with you.
Yeah, the Minister Koizumi would like to listen to you such a voice, I think.
Oh, good. I tried to invite him recently to give a talk, but he was too busy.
Oh, okay. And now the question to the Nicholas. I was really interested in your presentation on the refugee policy of Japan. And actually, I covered and I visited the one detention, I would say, detention camp of the refugees in the Ushiku facility. It's nearby the Narita Airport, Tokyo area. But so I have the very basic, I think I have the very basic knowledge about this issue. My question is, so how do you apply such a humanitarian support or humanitarian initiative for refugees caused by the climate change? I think the refugees caused by the climate change, I can imagine that maybe boat people from the sinking islands somewhere in the Pacific. And those people could probably, they may have a different background, cultural background, also motivation to come up to Japan by small boats, for example. So the situation would be very different from the political, the refugees seeking a political asylum and just escaping from the reality of the climate change. So how do you think? How do you think what way to apply the humanitarian very, very good idea for refugees caused by climate change?
Do you mean in terms of policy?
In terms of policy, or you are rather focusing on the public support for the or public awareness for the refugees, right? So if in the case maybe how maybe if you are the activist in the field of human rights, for example, how do you get this public support for those refugees caused by climate change?
Sure. So I think the first step, I think, would be to acknowledge that there needs to be, not just in Japan, but in every country, an updating of our understanding of what a refugee is. Traditionally, refugees were only so-called political refugees. But actually, many states have been updating their definition of even that. So within political refugee, are we talking only about state agents of persecution? Right? So people saying North Korea, that's a state agent of persecution. Same thing for China. But what if you live in a country where the state doesn't function that well, and they allow militias to, terrorize people in certain parts of the country? It's not the state that's, the problem. The problem is a non-state agent. So currently, Japan doesn't recognize non-state agents of persecution. So they're a bit behind on that. And I know from interviewing Ministry of Justice bureaucrats, they have this very narrow definition of what the Refugee Convention is. And they say, oh, well, but it's the Refugee Convention. But that's partially true. But what they're leaving out is that, yes, but a lot of other countries have adapted and expanded their definition of refugee because people can flee a variety of complicated circumstances that don't necessarily correspond to what happened in World War II. So what I would say is you need to have an open dialogue, and I don't expect this is going to happen in Japan anytime soon because the Liberal Democratic Party doesn't want it, and the Ministry of Justice is staffed with people with a law enforcement background who, quite frankly, don't necessarily have the training or the interest in doing this. But you have to engage public opinion and say, look, we're a democracy, so we can't force this on you, but it would be in our interest to reconsider what, how we decide refugee claims, but also what our refugee policy is. And in doing that, the two things that I would do is I would talk about 311 and say, look, we've suffered from natural disaster. We've had internally displaced people. So Japanese people know what it's like to be displaced. They know what it's like to be refugees within our lifetime, right? The second thing that I would do is if I was these human rights groups, I would talk less about rights and more about needs. Obviously, we all believe in human rights, but recent studies on reducing exclusionary attitudes towards minorities and immigrants have found that the rights language can produce a backlash. Whereas if you talk about needs, You can say, look, irrespective of what, ideal situation we think should be, these people need help. We should probably help them. And it would be in our interest to do so. The last thing I would say is this problem is gonna impact Japan, whether Japan likes it or not, right? So in the survey, I didn't talk about this, but we also had a series of questions after our experiment asking people, should we send money or should we admit people? And some of the criticism I got from the first study was, well, but yes, people might want to help people, but if your only option is to admit people, maybe you're not accounting for the fact that Japan sends millions to refugee camps overseas. Abe sends, I think, tens of millions of dollars, $30 million US, I think, in response to the Syrian refugee crisis, but said we're not going to admit any Syrian refugees. What we found in the survey so far is a majority of respondents said, no, we should admit people. So I think it's going to be a long-term process. I wouldn't expect to turn this around in a year or two, but I think if you have a sustained strategy, I imagine that, and politicians willing to act on this, I do believe the Japanese would support admitting more refugees if you focus on needs.
Thank you. And then lastly, Dr. Lewis. I was really interested in your presentation, especially supply chain issue was, I knew some of them, but it wasn't, also I had new findings. My question is very simple. When we think about for example, wind turbines, I actually covered the issue in Hokkaido, northern part of Japan. I remember the one thing, of course, was the supply chain for making devices are very important issue, but especially in the case of Japan, to acquire the installation site, it's very difficult. So installation site for wind turbines especially requires a huge ones, and without mainly less people and less animals, and also the need power line cables connected with, especially with Tokyo. So when we think about the supply chain, not really supply chain, but the need a space for installation to get more renewable energies. So this topic could be out of your interest, but I would like to listen to your opinion. How can we manage to get the proper installation sites for those renewables? Not only the wind turbines, but I think this is a kind of universal issue connected with the boosting the renewable energy.
Thank you for the question. If I understand correctly, there's a variety of factors, of course, and many of them are sort of nationally specific that affect where sites are selected for wind turbine projects, for example. And wind tends to be more challenging to site than some of the other technology areas. Solar, you can put on a roof, right? So you're not usually sort of displacing the use of whatever was there previously, and while you can put wind turbines in farmland, as you mentioned, you often want to put them in relatively close proximity to the actual the load, which in urban areas can be very challenging to site. And that's why I know Japan is looking a lot at offshore wind technologies. Many places that have dense coastal urban areas offshore can make more sense than building large scale and long distance transmission, which is what would be needed, if you're essentially putting these technologies far from an urban center. But there have been many innovations in transmission that can make this, viable as well. It really just depends on the country. And so, it is directly connected to supply chains, because the manufacturers of these technologies, they want to see a consistent, stable, long-term demand for these technologies before particularly they decide to move manufacturing facilities to a specific location. So I had done some work several years ago that looks at sort of what is the minimum demand, that you need to see within a certain domestic environment in order for local manufacturing to actually be incentivized there. We have this situation where, of course, many countries want to capture the economic benefits from local manufacturing of clean energy technologies, job creation, right, and all these things. But if you don't have the policies in place and the sort of broader enabling environment, including, an ability to cite in a way that, it can sort of not get bogged down in bureaucracy and decision making, this is really important, and this is going to be one of the main factors about whether you can sort of succeed as in the manufacturing space and not just the deployment space. And so, Japan is actually one is really quite unique actually in the wind energy space, because it has deployed a fair amount of wind energy, but doesn't really have a leading national wind turbine manufacturer. Mitsubishi used to, do some in this area, but for the most part, they haven't sort of been able to capture the manufacturing side of the industry in the way that even South Korea and China have, and India and others, and the United States and Europe. So I think these things do actually have to go hand in hand. And we see in batteries and electric vehicles, as the IRA, which was mentioned, is trying to incentivize local manufacturing in the United States. Companies don't want to move here. They don't want to shift their manufacturing out of China unless the United States can also have, very clear policy signals that people are going to buy these things, and that there's going to be a long-term demand, because you need that, incentive to really put in the initial investment to build a large-scale facility.
Thank you.
Great. We have several other questions, so I'm going to collect a few. I think I first saw Sam Sekiguchi, who is one of the associates with the U.S.-Japan Relations Program.
Thank you so much. I have 2 questions for Nicholas, but
Maybe just one question.
Okay, one question. A quick question about education policy or education approaches to the refugees issues. Because as you said, Japanese people are still skeptical about the refugees issues, particularly because Japan is a country where people has relatively low consciousness for refugees, because Japan is a homogeneity country. But I think if we really wanted to change the public recognitions or the opinion on this issue, I think the education could be one helpful approach. So one idea is to introduce a humanitarian education to the high school or the university. So I'd like to know your thought on that, or is there the current situation or policy is going on?
And while you're thinking of your answer, I'm going to collect 2 more questions. I have Joe, did you want to?
Yeah, please. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. This is a question for Yves. Really great analysis, and I'm wondering if what you're suggesting then is that we're seeing a kind of convergence between ecological imperatives and industrial policy, thereby making it easier, or sort of alignment of incentives. Reminds me of in the social policy space when active labor market policies were being introduced as a way of creating more of a social safety net, but justified as an economic driver. And if that's the case, then is this alignment or convergence of incentives based on changing consumer preferences, or is it about government subsidies? And are these government subsidies now a form of industrial policy themselves?
And on that, I'd also add, Shin had added a question in the chat asking, is it right that in Japan and China, there has not been an effort to raise fossil fuel energy prices for consumer households as another part of this pricing mechanism? And we also have a question in the chat from Kentaro Yamamoto, a visiting scholar from Hokkai Gakuen University at the program in U.S.-Japan Relations. He asks to Yves, but I would also turn it to Joanna about the question of foreign pressure. And how is the foreign pressure related to climate change policies? Is it different than the foreign pressure that was applied on other issues, our traditional trade negotiations over textiles and agriculture? And the reason I say I think this also relates to Joanna is even talked about foreign pressure from the US as well as peer pressure, this like who can do more. And then Joanna, you mentioned the geopolitical barriers to supply chain and this question of, if everyone creates siloed supply chains. And so looking back at it, to what extent is there competition to get out first and lock down supplies, which might hurt development? But we also see some dynamic where that competition makes it, it justifies spending because you don't want to fall behind. And we might see that geopolitical rivalry makes governments a little more motivated to put this at the top of their priority list. So if you think about how does geopolitical rivalry shape, is it a positive or negative force when you think about the development of green technology? So both Yamamoto Sensei's question about the Gaiatsu is different and a little bit more on geopolitical rivalry. So you've got a few questions to Joanna and Yves, and we have Sam's question to you, Nick. You're ready to start up?
Yes, so I'll keep it brief. I think, again, humanitarianism is a psychological impulse. So I don't necessarily think that there's a way to, at least I'm not aware of a way to foster that, but recent studies in political science, and I'd be happy to talk more, share this with you, that draw on insights from psychology. There's a term called perspective taking, where somebody from a minority background who has experienced bullying or some kind of discrimination or some kind of hardship can explain that and say, look, I know, average voter who's conservative and, is skeptical. I know you have that issue on this policy. Despite that, these have been my experiences, or I have a friend who's gone through this, and that person, needed help, needed support. Several political science and psychology studies have found that perspective taking, getting people to think about other people's experiences and learning from that, can be a way to change people's minds. So if there's a way to incorporate that into education, not just Japan, but everywhere, I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you so much.
To Yves, and then turn it back to Joanna.
Yeah, so it was great to be in the panel with Joanna, so thank you. And the bundle of questions from actually all three is around the same kind of general idea. So in the short term, to respond to Joe, the case in point is the IRA, right? So at one level, it's described by many, in the US, NGO community, but also globally as the biggest climate game changer so far in the US, but globally. So it's like, wow, this is big, finally. And a climate bill has gone through US Congress, right, which nobody thought was possible. So, but at the same time, is depicted in the EU in particular. We haven't heard enough, it's the top topic of du jour in the EU for the last month as a disaster, as for the liberal international order, because it's doing it by hurting the EU the most. So it's a stab on the back of the EU. Japan, by the way, is angry. Korea is angry. But when I asked a senior Métis person in December, the response was, we're very angry because it's destroying the liberal international order in some ways. But for Japan, it's less painful than for EU because we're already building a lot of the stuff in the US. So a lot of the firms will be less hurt than the EU firms that have a lot of displacement. So, we literally know that a lot of German firms and other European firms are now lining up to invest in all over southern state, actually, where there's no union, including West Virginia. Thank you, Joe mentioned. I mean, you've done a master coup here. So there is that dynamic. And so the short of it is, at one level, it's generating an acceleration in climate policy and climate, technology. There was not enough R&D for 30 years in climate stuff. Mm-hmm. Now there is. But on the other hand, it's hard to know where the equilibrium will go because it's unleashed a chain reaction of things where every country is waking up to the fact that the liberal international order doesn't exist in this field anymore. China broke it first, the US now. Japan, Korea always, anyway, had a backup plan. They always had a half belief about the market, but they're getting fully into that game. Taiwan is getting into the game. And the EU is having the debate this Thursday, Friday, this week. but they're going to be fighting to death over this because the French, the Germans want to do like the US, but the Dutch and the Finns don't want. So there's a whole problem. And plus they would have to change state aid policy and all that stuff. And then whether eventually, back to what Joanna was saying, we don't know yet if this competition will lead to convergence or to a mutual acceleration, a positive competition, or whether it would lead to some pretty nasty stuff, because what the driver is not consumer, it's security.
Right.
So it's driven under a security, which can lead to zero-sum game dynamics and some very, very competitive dynamics over many things. So it will take some nudging, it will take some cooperation. Hopefully along the competition, there will be diplomatic engagement. And now it's not happening, as Joanna said.
That's what I thank you.
Joanna, would you like to make a few remarks?
Yes, thank you. I mean, to this question about whether competition or rivalry is, sort of positive or negative overall for clean energy or green technology development, I think it's important to sort of define your end goal here. So if your goal is innovation, which is what we've been focused on for the last couple of decades, essentially making renewables cost competitive with fossil fuels in the power sector, and then now we're doing this in transportation, eventually industrial sector, et cetera. So if innovation is your goal, then competition is good, because you actually want competition between companies, between technologies, right, before you sort of pick the winners, as it were. And we've seen, I mentioned, for example, when China protected its wind market very early on from global competitors, this actually was detrimental to innovation. And we saw sort of many technology failures because if you have a protected market and you have to buy Chinese wind turbines, the quality can, there's sort of no incentive for quality control or these sorts of things if you're not competing with the Danes or the Germans or the Americans. So in that sense, in the sort of earlier stages, I think competition is very important. But, if your goal is deployment, the massive large-scale deployment that we need to see to get to this 1.5 degree net zero world, then the most important thing is how do we deploy these technologies quickly at large scale, and therefore we just need them to be as cheap as possible and as scalable as possible, right? And that's where this competition can be problematic, because we're now kind of entering this world, right, where we may see these sort of duplicative supply chains, redundancies, inefficiencies. All this just translates into higher costs, and that is particularly problematic because where we need to see most of the deployment of these technologies is not in the United States and Europe, but in the developing world, and where cost sensitivities are, even more robust. So, and on this question of pricing that was raised in the chat, I mean, this is why cost is so important. I mean, you actually, in most countries around the world, it's actually cheaper if you are looking to build a new electricity generation, to build wind or solar than to build coal or gas, because the cost of these technologies have come down so rapidly in the last few years, even just in the last 5 years. And so, whereas when Europe and the United States were deploying these technologies in the 80s and 90s, you needed large-scale subsidies to make them competitive, and that's no longer the case. So we're just in a very different regime now, and the obstacles to these technologies don't tend to be economic, they tend to be political. And so, and then I know we're out of time, but just lastly, I think competition, as Yves mentioned, is also just bad for stability. Climate is one area where the United States and China have a relatively constructive, positive relationship. If we lose that, we don't have a lot left. And then we sort of are in this real, this sort of new Cold War mentality that I think could lead to much more problematic global situation.
Right. Our most recent example where a climate surveillance balloon could have been a military surveillance weapon, we don't know. And but it is interesting to think about how can the shared need for cooperation on climate change lead to innovation and sharing of the technology. And that actually touches on some of the themes that came up in our health panel earlier today about this trade-off between the incentives to ramp up private gain with strong intellectual property rights that were entrenched in trade rules and can become an a problem for the global commons, the need for wide sharing. And here also we see the geopolitical rivalry might lead to an arms race and subsidies, but if that makes it more difficult to have true technological innovation, it could be a problem as well. So difficult conversations. I'm glad we could have you all join us today. We've got a great group of experts and each of them has written books. And so I hope that this conversation will lead you to both go back and read their books and continue to think about these problems in our own research going forward. I want to thank you, Joanna, for joining us online. And thank you, Yves, for traveling from Vancouver, and Nick for helping both to organize the entire group and presenting your research. We've had a great session, and it all is made possible. The funding from Japan Foundation, and most importantly, the organizational work. As I mentioned, Nick Fraser helped with organizing and thinking of ideas for invitations, and Jennifer Christ and Shin Fujihira did a lot of organizational work to bring us all together here, both virtually and in person. So thank you so much for the event, and we look forward to continuing these important conversations.